Hello, my name is Mark Gibson, and you're listening to the podcast version of the Teagasc Signpost Series, a weekly webinar that promotes and examines sustainability in Irish farming.
Good morning, everybody. Nicky, thank you very much for talking to us this morning. Nicky, you're based in Grange, a livestock systems researcher. How long have you been there, or could you tell us a little bit about yourself before you begin your presentation this morning?
No problem, Andy. So I'm here implementing the dairy calf to beef research program at Teagasc Grange since the autumn of 2018. I would have begun. So in today's presentation, with some of the data from the start of that journey. But prior to that, I suppose I would have done my PhD at Teagasc Moor Park, where I worked on perennial ryegrass evaluations and identifying new grazing traits. So really taking a lot of that type of a background that I had, I brought that forward into implementing, really sustainable grass-based production systems. And I suppose the quest now that I have is trying to identify animals that have the certain traits that allow them to excel within that grass-rich environment. So really, it's just taking your learnings from one part of your career, bring them on to the next part and implementing those. And look, the same principles apply the same overall objective. So look, grass is our main feedstuff. 80 to 90% of our feed requirement is met from forage grown on our farm. So that background has really, given me a good footing in that. But now the challenge is to identify the animal that can best use that and reduce their age of slaughter, their impact on the environment, and most importantly, deliver a sustainable margin for the farmers that are undertaking the production of them.
So if you can fire up your presentation and share your screen with us and begin your presentation.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Today I'm just going to discuss a little bit about, the added value that can be got from using high merit beef sires on our dairy herd. And I suppose the focus of today's presentation is on, dairy farmers. It's very timely at the moment. Dairy farmers are, have begun the breeding season. And really, every farmer should have a beef breeding policy in place for their herd for this year and in subsequent years going forward. And look, lots of farmers have had that, and maintain that, over time. But I think we certainly do need a renewed emphasis on that. And also, I'd like to appeal to anyone involved in the industry at various levels, that they be conscious of the importance of dairy beef breeding policy and put that forward to farmers that they may be working with. And also for beef farmers, today I want to outline the importance of high quality beef animals and what they can contribute to their business. Because ultimately, if the beef farmer doesn't require a higher quality animal or of a higher genetic potential, it won't be necessarily. We have to give a market signal back to dairy farmers that we want, higher merit animals that are, capable of sustaining our systems. So I suppose just to begin and looking at the structure of the dairy beef industry in Ireland, we have in excess of 1 million calves available for beef production from the dairy herd on an annual basis. So it's a really, it's a big outlet of calves that are there. And I suppose at the moment in excess of, we're just approaching in excess of 60% of Irish beef cattle processed in Irish meat plants are of direct dairy origin. So it's a really important aspect of our beef industry. So we have to be very conscious of the decisions that are made on dairy farms, that they have a massive impact on our credentials as beef producing nation. But I suppose if we look at those 1 million calves that are available, about a third of them remain on dairy farms and are sold off at later stages, either as weaned calves at the end of the summer, as yearlings the following spring, or in fact, about 12% of the calves that are bred in dairy farms are brought right through to slaughter on the farms that they're born on. Another 30 calves are traded farm to farm, so they're really, entering into our dairy beef systems, purchasing calves at, 3 to 4 weeks of age, artificially rearing them and bringing them right through to slaughter. And I suppose the final third of calves that we have, or the final third, the final outlet of calves that we have are live exports, early slaughter systems, and I suppose there's some on-farm mortalities, etc., where some calves are lost out of the system. So really, it's that area of export and early early slaughter systems that I think there's real opportunity, you know, to displace the number of calves entering into those outlets and to convert them into highly valuable calves that can enter into our dairy beef systems and contribute positively to that. So if we look at the number of farms, you know, that are purchasing calves year on year, we've just about 10,000 dairy beef farmers going out purchasing and artificially rearing calves on an annual basis. And they're relatively small systems, and they often complement, you know, another on-farm enterprise such as suckling or sheep or tillage. And they're only purchasing about 37 calves. But there's a major challenge out there. You know, when ICBF have looked at it, they can see that there's a very high attrition rate in farmers rearing calves year on year. And when they looked at it over a 5-year period, only 39% of farmers that purchase calves in year 1 of that cycle remain purchasing calves in year 5. So that really puts forward a lot of research questions for us as to try and understand why are farmers opting out of the system. And, you know, there's lots of different reasons. You know, there's a lot of skill involved in rearing calves. There can be a lot of disease challenge, respiratory, etc. But ultimately, it's the margin that has been achieved from these systems, you know, has been challenging. Like all beef systems, you know, it has been a challenge for many farmers, and they have opted out. But really, why it has been a challenge is you know, are the calves of high enough merit? Is the technical efficiency on farm, you know, via grassland, is that high enough to get the animal performance targets that we need to achieve? And also health, you know, if we've incidences of health in early life, we know that they can have a negative impact on lifetime animal performance and contribute greatly to the cost of production. So really, we need to try and address those challenges. But there's massive benefits of an improved dairy beef breeding policy. And if we look at them on dairy farms, you know, if we can have calves of higher genetic merit, ultimately they will be of increased demand by beef farmers in the spring. And having, you know, a reliable outlet for your calves in the spring, it can ensure they move off farm in a timely fashion, freeing up, you know, valuable resources such as shed space, pressure on labor, you know, so there can be real efficiency. You know, it's not getting more money for your calves, it's getting a more reliable outlet, getting calves moved off farm, and, you know, that there's massive economic gains to come from that. But probably even more importantly, the social acceptance of you know, our systems that are producing a really valuable calf that's valued, you know, in another system. You know, that's really important that our dairy systems have that outlet and are producing a top quality product that can go on and contribute positively to agriculture in this country. And also, you know, dairy beef is going to play a really important role in herds that are, you know, chasing genetic gain and that are implementing high levels of selection intensity and been real, you know, fussy about the dams that breed their future replacements. And I think we're at a time now where we're not necessarily seeing that much expansion. We're seeing farmers increase in their selection intensity, and that means that there's more of a role in your herd to use beef bulls. And really, if you don't have, you know, a high level of beef usage within your herd, you have to ask yourself the question, how intense is the selection? Or, you know, how good a breeding policy have you in place that you're not using a high level of high quality beef sires from the very start of the breeding season? And really, if we look at the beef side, you know, the benefits of having a reliable and consistent source of high merit dairy beef animals, you know, the increased availability early on in the spring, you know, that's going to be really important going forward. And we know that these high merit animals, you know, they're going to bring greater efficiency over, you know, inferior beef animals or, you know, purebred dairy animals. We know that there's efficiency in terms of feed usage, the conversion efficiency of that feed into carcass, but importantly, you know, ultimately it'll lead to greater economic and environmental efficiency via reduced age of slaughter or increased carcass output at a younger age. And really, you know, we have the opportunity to produce a really, really high quality product from our dairy beef animals. You know, in terms of the weight specification, it can produce a very favourable carcass size and a very good meat eating quality. It has a great ability to lay down flesh and have a nice dressing. But what we found is that we can produce, an in-spec carcass from a predominantly grass-based diet, and we're achieving up to 87% of the lifetime feed requirements of our dairy beef animals in our research herds being filled on a dry matter basis from homegrown forage, grazed grass, and conserved grass silage. But really, nationally, a renewed emphasis on dairy beef is going to play an important role in meeting Irish agriculture's greenhouse gas reduction targets. And I know Andrew Cromie was on last week, and he outlined, how it's going to contribute to that. So look, I won't go over too much this week, but I think, it's going to play a really, really important role in enhancing our sustainability. And it'll be on an economic level, environmental, and social. So really, it is one of those real areas of improvement for enhancing our sustainability. But I suppose on farm, there's a couple of decisions that farmers have to make. And look, there's various tools there that can help in making these decisions. And I suppose it'll begin with bull selection. And we're very fortunate now that we have, many indexes available, but the dairy beef index, is one that's there for farmers to identify bulls that offer the best balance of calving traits as well as carcass traits. So it can identify bulls that suit the needs of both cohorts of farmers, dairy and beef. And, I think it's a really important tool as well in developing sires for future use on the dairy herd. We now have a breeding goal for developing sires with the dairy beef market in mind. Cow selection is going to be really important. And, at the start of the year, you need to sit down, identify the cows that are going to get, going to breed your future replacement, or the cows that are going to breed your beef calf. And really, that cow, the parity of the cow, that'll determine, the bull you can use. And I suppose, for instance, not all cows, if they're going to get a beef bull, they're cycling early on in the season, you're probably not as sensitive to a bull that offers a slightly longer gestation length at that very early stage in the breeding season. So there's different bulls to suit different cows at different time points. And, it's really important to have a very tailored dairy beef breeding policy, and have a very similar, attention to detail that you would have on your selecting the sires of your future heifer replacements. The timing of when we use the beef straw is really important. And I suppose looking back, traditionally, these beef straws go in, in the later part of the breeding season after you've inseminated enough cows to generate your replacement heifer crop. But we know with sex semen, more fertile herds, and probably a requirement for lower replacement rates, there's now more of a role to use beef bulls throughout the breeding season. And we found, looking at our research animals, that date of birth, plays a big role in explaining a lot of the variation in our carcass performance. And for instance, if we go a week later, every week later our beef calf is born, it can reduce carcass weight by 3 to 3.5 kilos. So it's a really, really important trait. And why it's important is date of birth. The date a calf is born will determine its ability to utilize grazed grass over that first grazing season. And that's really, really important in dairy beef production. But I suppose we talked about picking beef bulls, but we have to be conscious that, maybe not all beef bulls are better. And we have to be, only ensuring that we pick the best bulls there in terms of carcass traits, but that are also acceptable in terms of gestation length and calving ease. And if we look at Alan Toomey did this analysis previously, and he looked at the distribution of Angus and Holstein Friesians for carcass weight PTA. And if you look at the graph, you can see in the green bar and Holstein Friesian, and in the black bars we've our Angus, and we can see that there's an overlap in terms of the high end of the Holstein Friesians and the lower end of the scale in terms of Angus bulls in terms of their carcass weight potential. So really that's not, those beef bulls offer little advantage over, Holstein Friesian animals in terms of carcass performance. So we're not really getting the advantage of the beef animal in terms of carcass performance from that type of selection. So really we need to shift the focus and move up, up into those positive figures in terms of the beef bulls that we're using on our dairy cows to ensure that we add and inject in some more efficiency into the scenario. And I suppose back in 2018 and 2019, these are the two calf crops that fed into this data that we have on the table here. And really what we did here in the first column, we have our Holstein Friesian animal, our high EBI type animal, and we could see the type of performance we could achieve from them. And look, it's really good relative to the national average. So we were just under 23 months age at slaughter, producing a 300 kilo carcass, but we can see at an O- a confirmation grade, that is out of spec in terms of confirmation. And that is so we're producing a sufficient quantity of beef, but it's beef of a lower value. We're not maximizing our price per kilo, and that really limits the margin that we can return in those systems. Whereas we see probably very comparable levels of carcass output from our Angus sired animals in both of our groups, but what they did inject was confirmation, and that helped maximize the value of each of those kilos of beef. And it also reduced age at slaughter back down under 22 months of age. But I suppose we're a little bit disappointed when we looked at the performance between the high Aberdeen Angus, the high AA, and the low AA, where, these were bulls selected. So these were bulls used commercially on the dairy herd, but divergent for carcass weight and conformation. So they're top end and lower end of the scale. But unfortunately, there wasn't an awful lot differentiating between the high-end Angus bulls and the low-end Angus bulls used on the dairy herd at that time. But I think, over the last number of years, we have seen, a better offering of bulls, and we've seen better uptake of the higher merit bulls, and we'll see that reflected in some of the later data that we look at. But really what this data did show, that when we got our system right, our truly grass-based system, high-quality pasture, long grazing season, and when we managed the animals within that optimum environment, we could achieve, very good performance, big reductions, probably about 5 months younger in terms of age at slaughter at a comparable weight to the national average animal of the same breed makeup. So that gave us great hope that there was something here. There was a lot of variation in age at slaughter, and it kind of, you'll see some of the later questions that rose for us. I suppose when we look at our system performance in terms of economics, although there was maybe only slight improvements in conformation and a slight carcass weight advantage, you can see that when they multiply up across every kilo and every animal on the system, that, it could be a very a profitable system with a net margin there of €720 for our high merit animal versus 500 on our high EBI type animal. And also, that's on an economic level. Environmentally, it's going to have a very positive effect, as the younger age of slaughter ultimately means that we have a lower stocking rate in that system. So we've less slurry building up. The animal is producing less emissions as they're not alive for as long a period of time. And we also displace, imported concentrate out of the system as well, because of the requirement for a shorter finishing period with those beef cross animals. But look, I think there's so much more scope, and we are achieving a lot more than what we were achieving, 4 or 5 years ago even. And I suppose, look, I just put this together for different dairy discussion groups that we'd be engaging with. And it's from a paper by Dunnabury, and it looks at the effect of dam type when weighted to a range of sires. And really, I suppose if we look at the first column, we have our Holstein Friesian dam. And in the second column, I've chosen a 50-50 Jersey cross Holstein Friesian. And the reason I've picked that cow, we come across a lot of farmers that have that cow type, and they think that there's probably no hope to implement a better beef breeding policy on that cow type, that, she has Jersey in her, and, it's not possible to produce an on-spec carcass. So really, we want to, try and address that challenge, or that kind of conception that is out there. So if we look at the bottom column, and if we look at when those two respective cow types, or bottom row, when those two respective cow types are mated to a beef sire. So your average Angus sire, he's probably plus 6 kilos for carcass weight, being an average Angus. And when that bull is mated on a Holstein Friesian cow, they can produce a steer with a carcass of 327 kilos, but with a relatively good grade, O plus, borderline O equals. And that's in contrast to that same bull mated on a 50-50 Jersey Cross Holstein Friesian animal, which results in a carcass of 314 kilos. It's only 13 to 14 kilos lighter, and it's probably a grade less on the conformation grade. So it's probably not as big as what might be perceived out there nationally. But I would ask the question, if we used a higher merit beef bull on that 50-50 cross animal, can we achieve comparable or even better performance? So that's really what farmers need to embrace. It's not using the same bull on cows with two different beef merits themselves. If the cow is of a lower merit, we need to up our efforts on the sire that's chosen for her to, ensure that we produce an animal that's capable of producing an in-spec carcass. But I suppose this data was looking at your national average animal of those categories, and we could see that they were producing this type of carcass weight at 28 months. And just bear in mind, I suppose, bring forward, just remember the Holstein Friesian bull in the middle row, mated on the Holstein Friesian cow, producing a carcass weight of 320 kilos. We'll see in some of the later slides in our research systems, grass-based systems, that we're achieving that performance on Holstein Friesians, but at 24 months of age. So there is massive gains to be made by using better genetics, but ultimately implementing a better production systems. And then these are just a few illustrative pictures from Teagasc bred cattle, that went through the Tully Test Performance Centre in Kildare. And just this animal ahead of us, he's of a very low commercial beef value of €3. And that's because, his genetic makeup is he's 50% Jersey, 50% Holstein Friesian. So he's typically that 50-50 cross animals. But after, a very intensive finishing period, that animal only produced a 290 kilo carcass, a P plus, so very, very poor conformation grade. He's going to take massive price penalties. He's going to miss out on your quality assurance payment. But look, he was there in terms of flesh, 3 equals is acceptable. But if we take that in contrast to this animal, so again, this animal is an example of a limousine sire, a high merit limousine sire, been used on that 50-50 cross dam. And you can see that it increased the commercial beef value of that animal massively up to €81. And that's driven by their improved feed intake figures, their improved carcass weight, and improved, most importantly, the carcass conformation is what's going to improve massively. But we can see that even on that Jersey cross cow, that high merit limousine sire could produce an animal that under 24 months of age could produce a 349 kilo carcass with a brilliant grade of R plus. And you can see the positive margin of €1,574 that animal's carcass came into last January or February. So really I wanted to show those two examples, that there is scope to produce high quality carcasses, even if we do have low merit dams, that by putting enough focus on the sire, we really can add greater value to them. So I think every herd, regardless of cow type, or what you may perceive cow type to be in terms of beef merit, that there is scope there to make improvements. So everyone can make improvements, and there is a massive need for us to do that. And I think these animals are two good examples of those improvements that are possible. So certainly Andrew talked about it last week on his webinar about the need for greater integration of dairy and beef. And that is paramount. And we need to achieve that if we want to achieve or enhance our sustainability. We really do need to work on getting this integration. And I suppose we need to work on improving the profitability. So we need to ensure that we generate animals of high enough genetic merit that they can continue to produce animals that are capable of delivering a positive margin for our beef farms. Because if they don't, we won't have these systems, and we won't have these farmers going back to buy calves. And that can have another impact then on the profitability of the dairy farms if they're having to carry calves for longer, or holding them there, putting pressure on resources on farm. That's going to impact on their profitability. For the environment, Andrew outlined it last week, the huge gains through genetics, improvement in genetics, the impact that can have on the environment. They're hugely positive. But also dairy beef production, because of the fact we don't have to offset the emissions from a dam. We know that it has a lower impact per kilo of beef produced in comparison to alternative suckler beef production. And the social acceptance, dairy beef is going to go a long way in enhancing the social acceptance of our dairy production systems. And I suppose it can produce a very socially acceptable product, because dairy beef, it really can be a truly grass-based product produced in, using our natural resources that are available. So really, I think, we can really get positives on each of those pillars from a high-quality dairy beef industry. So I suppose, having looked at some of the earlier studies, just from one or two of those slides that we had up, we could see the gains that were achieved. It wasn't necessarily what we set out to do, but it was just from running and implementing a very, very optimized production system, the gains that we could achieve in reducing age of slaughter. So we went back and we tried to look at it and see, could we do something more on this front? So the objective of this study that we put in place was to quantify the gains achievable in reducing age of slaughter through genetic selection and optimizing grassland nutrition. So the study design that we put in place was a 3x3 factorial. So we had 3 animal genetic groups or genotypes. We had an early age of slaughter, a late age of slaughter Aberdeen Angus animal, and we had the top 4 sires from the economic breeding index, so top 4 Holstein Friesian sires. And we assigned each of those 3 genetic groups to 3 different feed managements. So we implemented different feeding strategies over the calves' first summer at pasture, and again during the second summer at pasture. And I suppose the age of slaughter EBV that was developed for this study, it was generated from the national dairy beef population, and we selected steer and heifer systems for the animals that made up the genetic evaluation. And we didn't want to confound the data, if there was young bulls or more intensive feedlot type systems feeding in data. We want an animal that's going to perform in a grass-based system. So we felt that steers and heifers, were the most representative of that. And the age of slaughter EBV that was generated was corrected for carcass weight, carcass conformation, and carcass fatness. So we wanted to identify, while all those things were constant, we wanted to see animals that could produce an on-spec carcass, but at a reduced age. And that's what we went about doing, and we think that we are achieving that. So it really is designed to be, very much an under 24-month type system. The stocking rate, look, we don't know where the stocking rate will end up, depending on the age of slaughter. We will have massive variation between the systems that have, high merit Anguses versus Holstein Friesian animals. We'll see a little later on. There's a wide gap in terms of the age of slaughter that's achieved from them. So that's going to have an impact on the organic nitrogen level of those farm systems and the overall farm stocking rate, and ultimately its impact on the environment. All calves are reared on previously identified milk feeding levels. So in the first years of the study, we compared different nutritional strategies in early life of the calf rearing, and we identified the 4 litre or half a kilo of milk replacer fed to calves per day from 3 weeks of age up to a weaning weight of 90 kilos, was the optimum. So everything that we rear through our system is reared on that system to great success. And the 3 management systems that we have in place is a grass only, or very much conventional. So this is where calves are, put to pasture, they're weaned off concentrate 2 to 3 weeks post turnout, and they remain on a grass only diet for the first grazing season. And again, for the second grazing season, they're on a grass only diet right up until housing prior to slaughter. The intermediate group, we decided that we'd supplement these calves 1 kilo of concentrates per day in addition to grazed grass over the first grazing season, and grass only for the second grazing season. And our high group, these were supplemented with 1 kilo a day as a calf, the same as the intermediate group, but we reintroduced concentrate from the 1st of July or towards the end of the second grazing season to see, could we manipulate these animals' age of slaughter through nutrition and genetics to produce an on-spec carcass without the need of going into a shed for an intensive finishing period at the end of the second grazing season. And just some of the animal measurements that were undertaken. And I suppose, growth, obviously, we weigh cattle every 2 weeks, and we get, very accurate average daily gain targets for that animal throughout their lifetime. And we can relate that back to, different nutritional or management strategies as well as the genotypes. Intake, I think, is we're getting lovely data coming from this. And ultimately, animals that suit a grass-based production systems, we know in dairy systems, cows with a higher voluntary intake of bulky forages, they probably perform, exceptionally well in our grass-based production system. So we're interested to see, is there a similar trend happening in beef animals suited to that grass-based system? And there could be a re-rank. These may not necessarily be the best animals on a more intensive indoor finishing diet, but we're interested in grass-based production, and that's why intake and grazing behaviour are really important to us. So Jamie O'Driscoll is the PhD student working on this, and he's currently undertaking another intake run. So he's using the in-alkane method to estimate the dry matter intake of our animals at pasture. And he's doing this on these cattle when they've been supplemented in the second part of the grazing season as well. So ultimately, he'll be able to see, is there a difference in the substitution rate when offered concentrates of these cattle of the differing genotypes. And as well as that, we do intake indoors. But also the grazing behaviour, there's really interesting data coming from this. We can see higher merit animals, they probably have a better grazing behaviour, a better rumination behaviour, and we probably see that they're really suited to a grass-based system. And, those grazing traits that they possess, they seem to be able to fuel the higher average daily gain or higher growth rate that animal is achieving, and ultimately are allowing it produce an on-spec carcass at a younger age. We also do a lot of linear and skeletal measurements to look at the development of these animals throughout their lifetime. We look at muscle and fat deposition of the animals using ultrasound scanning technology at different time points. And in particular, I'll present some of the data from the end of the second grazing season, because ultimately it's that time point that we're really interested in. Is an animal, have they sufficient fat depth to allow slaughtering at the end of that second grazing season? That's really is of interest to us. And obviously we've our basic carcass measurements on the Europe grid for conformation and fatness. We also measure kidney and channel fat internally in the carcass. It is a fat tax on the animals and takes up the use of energy to deposit a fat that has to be trimmed away from the internal cavities of the carcass. And we also measure primal yield. So we break up the carcass into the different cuts and assign them to different value categories. So if we look at the different live weight performance, we know we've all our different targets at the different time points in the animal's life. But if we look at our 3 genotypes, we can see the arrival weight, they're the exact same. So as you'd expect, there's no difference in the arrival weight of the 3 genotypes or the 3 feed management groups, because we haven't implemented the feed management differences at that stage. And again, at weaning, no difference. Weaning at the 90 kilos, no difference in genotype or feed management. So that's what we really, would expect to see in those. However, if we go forward and look at the housing weight of these animals at the end of the first grazing season, we can see the genotype come into play. We can see the early animals, so the early age at slaughter Angus animal has a weight advantage at housing, and that's really important, and it'll stand to their subsequent performance thereafter. So we can see a significant genotype effect at the end of the first grazing season. But interestingly, we see no effect of the feed management. So that kilo a day that we fed those calves over the first grazing season had no impact on animal live weight performance at the end of the first grazing season, and there was no detectable difference thereafter, of that kilo a day over the first grazing season. And that's in that instance where we had really high quality pasture, we had the same date of birth, the same genetic makeup in each of those groups. Obviously, if you have very young calves, there probably will be a better response from the younger calves rather than the older calves. If we look at the turnout weight, again, those high merit early age of slaughter animals, they continue to grow at a higher growth rate during the first winter indoors and were turned out well ahead of target. Your target on the 1st of March is 330 kilos. We can see the only group that was ahead of that was the high merit animal. So the high merit animal is more capable of achieving those minimum growth requirements and that are outlined in our dairy beef production blueprints. They are capable of achieving them. And then if we jump forward and look at the housing weight, so at the end of the second grazing season, we can see again across all the different feed managements, the early group of animals, were 40 kilos heavier than their other Angus comrades. And we can see that the feed management kicked into play. So this represents the feed management, the animals that were supplemented with a barley-based concentrate grown natively at the end of the second grazing season, that this helped, improve animal live weight performance and the deposition of fat on some of the important points on the animal. But it maybe didn't necessarily mean the same to each of the animal categories. It did put more weight in them, but it may not have actually got, for example, the Holstein Friesians grew more, but they didn't get any fleshier. And if we just look at some of those ultrasound scanning results of these animals at the end of the second grazing season, we can see very little difference really between the two Angus groups, the early and late group, that they had an equal ability to flesh. We know that there was big weight differences, but they had an equal ability to lay down fat and become ripe. So that is important. We can see the advantage that those two breeds brought, over a Holstein Friesians. You can see the Holstein Friesian animal, had lower subcutaneous fat, across the rib, the lumbar, on the rump. It was always significantly lower than our Angus comrades. And as well as that, the muscle depth, the depth of that strip line on those animals was lower as well. As well as that, there was no difference in the IMF. So the IMF represents the percentage of fat that that occupies the ribeye of the animal, and we know that that's very favorable. A higher level of that is very favorable, as there's enhancements to the perceived meat eating quality, with higher levels of intramuscular fat. But look, we can see the feed management, it kicked into play. So the animals that were supplemented late on at the end of the second grazing season, they had a deeper muscle depth, and they also had more fat on the rump of the animal, and overall they had a higher body condition score. So that was important to identify that there was the genotypes played a role, as well as the feeding the animals from the 1st of July in the second grazing season could help manipulate the deposition of fat on these animals. And ultimately, this is the performance that we achieved. So if we look at the first section, the GO category, that is the grass-only category, so very much conventional system. So these animals, these weren't supplemented in the second grazing season, and none of them were fit to be slaughtered at the end of the second grazing season, and they had to go forward for an intensive indoor finishing period. And we can see the effect of the early genotype. We can see, about 25 kilos extra carcass weight from that animal. After the same number of feed days, the same age of slaughter, we saw that we had an extra, 25 kilos of carcass weight. So that's a really, really important factor there. And if we look at our Holstein Friesian animal, we see that they produced a comparable level of carcass weight to our high merit Angus, but it was at a significantly lower carcass conformation. And it was after an extra 70 days of intensive indoor finishing. And we know the impact, it required twice the amount of concentrate to be fed over the finishing period, and it's going to put a higher stocking rate on that Holstein Friesian system. It's going to produce a lot more slurry. It's going to have a lot of negative implications, that extra 2 months of intensive finishing that they required to produce the same carcass weight. So that really, depicts the efficiency difference between our Holstein Friesian and our high merit beef animal. The intermediate group, so they got fed 1 kilo a day as a calf, but they produced the eggs. There was no detectable difference in any of the metrics between the grass only group and the intermediate group. So that really, answered the question on the first year at pasture that there was little advantage there was no advantage of giving a kilo a day throughout the first grazing season to those calves. If we look at the high group, so these are the animals that got a kilo a day as a calf, and we reintroduce concentrate from the 1st of July. I think this is a really interesting group, and it really shows the potential that is out there, or the options that the high merit animals give us over the lower merit animal. So if we look at the early genotype within that group, they were slaughtered at just over 20 months without going into a shed at the end of the second grazing season. They consumed 470 kilos of concentrate, but they produced a very much on spec carcass at 306 kilos, O equals on the grid, and a perfect fat score. If we look at our later or lower merit Angus animals, the same age of slaughter, but you must remember that our EBV was corrected for carcass weight. So that identified animals at the same carcass weight that would be, 2 to 3 weeks younger or older at age of slaughter. So if we look at the carcass weight that they produced a carcass of nearly 30 kilos lighter, and they were only 269 kilos carcass weight as steers. So that's, under our spec is 270. So half of them animals were out of spec in terms of weight. And, if we were to take their heifer cum rates, they would be, of a very, very light carcass weight. And, I think light carcass weight really limits our ability to slaughter animals early. So we need to identify animals that can produce a carcass that is on spec at a younger age if we're to get, national uptake of age of slaughter as a breeding objective. So really, I think that is really important, that we can see that it takes an intensive indoor finishing period to get the lower merit Angus animal up to producing an on-spec carcass. Whereas we've the option, when we have a high merit Angus for age of slaughter, we have the option of finishing them at the end of the second grazing season without the need of going indoors. So really what we could do, we could identify animals based on their genetic merit, that we could assign them to a certain type of feed management to allow them express their full potential for age of slaughter, and qualify the animal to suit a particular system and really optimize our farm systems. And by reducing the age of slaughter and avoiding the intensive finishing period, we've a pit of silage left over from that animal genotype group. But however, that pit will be sold into the Holstein Friesian system, where we can see that despite being fed at pasture, they couldn't lay down enough flesh. So they were fed at pasture the same as the Angus's, but they had to go in for a further 138-day intensive indoor finishing period. They produced, they had to consume in excess of a ton of concentrate, and they produced 344 kilo carcass. So really, we have to ask ourselves, they produced a higher carcass weight, but at a cost. And if we look at it on a system basis, we're going to be able to carry fewer of them animals. So it would probably end up having a lower carcass output per hectare. And really, that is the metric that we're interested in, is carcass output per hectare as influenced by the animal genotype. And, that early animal, I think offers the greatest flexibility. And, carcass weight is going to be important. If we're to produce the carbon equivalent produced per kilo of beef, we have to have animals that can produce a sufficiently heavy carcass, but at a younger age. And we'll get a dilution effect by ensuring that they produce a heavy enough carcass.
Nicky, sorry for interrupting you there, but you're coming to the conclusion. I just wanted to leave a little bit of time for questions.
Yeah, sorry, absolutely. Yeah. So just to conclude, look, where our work is focused, and I think there's a real opportunity by improving our emphasis on beef used on the dairy herd to future-proof both of those industries. And we can see, high merit beef genetics, they're low cost but proven technology, and they can be used this evening. If you have a cow bulling this evening, it will cost you no more to pick a good quality beef bull to use on that animal rather than the bull of the day. And it's going to go a long way in helping to improve our sustainability across those multiple pillars. And each herd, has the opportunity to add further value at very little cost. And everyone needs to think, what do dairy beef systems need? And I think we need to build it. We mightn't necessarily get it. They mightn't be demanding it exactly today, but I think we need to build the product and build the market, and then people will, identify those animals and will develop these systems around them if they're available. So that's my presentation for today. And look, we're here. We have a great team of technologists and students doing great work in dairy beef production and furthering age of slaughter. And look, we're there to help. If anyone has any queries, they can get in contact.
Thanks very much, Nicky, for that presentation. And if you might just stop sharing your screen now, and then we can revert back to the discussion. Nicky, that was a very detailed presentation. There's a couple of questions coming in on the chat, and I'll leave them to Pat. And I'd just like to welcome Pat to our webinar this morning. Pat actually was supposed to be hosting, but they had a
power cut at 9:30.
An early indication of the energy crisis in Wexford this morning. But there was just two things, Nicky, and maybe they're a little bit outside of your remit. But there was two statistics that struck me. One was earlier on where you mentioned the 39%, nearly 40% attrition rate among farmers. And I know it's an ICVF figure. Have we any idea of where, I mean, if you stop doing something, are they transferring to something else? Have we any idea of why that is? Or, well, we probably know why, but where are they going, or what are they?
See, I think a lot of those are farms that would have another beef enterprise in play on the farm. So they're typically probably suckler farms that went out and purchased calves, see how they get on with that system, and through one reason or another, they chose to opt out of that system. And look, you will see it. You'll come across a lot of farmers, and that's really, we want to put in blueprints, the management blueprints that will outline the type of management you need to put in place to rear these calves and meet those targets, and also identify the genetics that will work as well, and give farmers the best possible experience of rearing calves. And look, that is a challenge. We'll be all well familiar with it, but I think if we pull a lot of our efforts together, I think we greatly can improve that. We have a lot of herds now. Nearly all the herds we're buying calves from, they're all vaccinating the dams to protect them against the different strains of scour. We've better vaccination programs and herd health plans now to combat the respiratory challenge. And if we didn't have our really diligent herd health plan in place, we vaccinate every calf on 24 hours after arrival. We vaccinate intranasally to get a rapid effect to protect against different viral types of respiratory challenge. And if we didn't do those, we would have massive challenges. And really, if we've low levels of specialization on farm, or kind of, dipping in and out of dairy calf to beef production, we may not get some of these health protocols implemented as diligently as we have. And look, that's, a bad experience can put people off. But I think we've great scope to, to bring in genetics, health, and the grassland nutrition all together and getting them.
Yeah, and one other stat that hit me as well, roughly a third of our calves are exported, and we constantly hear of, it could come under pressure, it could come under threat. There's always seems to be motions going through European Parliament about possibly putting an end to this. I mean, if something like that did happen, could that have massive implications for our systems? You know, taking that with a high rate of attrition of farmers actually rearing the animals.
Yeah, I don't necessarily think. I think if we've high enough quality calves, I think there's demand here domestically for high quality beef calves. If you look at the dairy beef steers in particular, have the highest probability of producing an inspect carcass in terms of the age the animal is slaughtered at, the weight it's at, the conformation grades, and the fat scores. So there's huge potential there for dairy beef. There's a great market for dairy beef. You know, it's availing of the highest value retail markets that are there. So I think if we've the good enough calf quality early on in the season, you know, look, they're all the lower value dairy males that are exported. And I think if we can convert them into high merit beef cross calves, that there is going to be more domestic demand for them here. And not necessarily, look, calf exports, you know, the animal is a lot younger. It's maybe a lot more vulnerable at that stage. You know, there's very vibrant markets there for the export of older animals. So we could, you know, bring those animals into different categories and widen up and reduce our reliance on one or two key export markets for calves, bring forward a higher quality animal and maybe at an older age that can be exported to a wider range of destinations. But okay, I'd ask the question, is there more value to be got from some of these animals within our own shores?
Okay, yeah, that's
and I think that there is potential there.
Yeah. Pat, we have a few technical questions there coming in because we're running
low on time.
The clock.
Yeah, Nicky, one here. Nicky, excellent presentation. I'm a dairy farmer. What criteria do I need to be looking at to produce these early finishing steers? So as the dairy farmer, what do I need to be doing?
Yeah, no, a good question, and it's great to get engagement from dairy farmers. Look, I'd be looking. Firstly, look at your dairy beef index. It'll identify a bull that has an appropriate calving. You know, it'll show the level of calving difficulty for each of them. So really, I'd be looking at your dairy beef index and make sure that desire that at least 50% of the overall index is coming from the beef contribution, and then from within that, you know, I pick animals with a high carcass weight, because carcass weight in our figures as it is, it's corrected to a set age. So it's identifying that animal that can produce a heavier carcass at a certain age. So I think carcass weight is a really important one, and carcass conformation. So if you're to identify a high quality beef bull, I'd be saying he'd be plus 10 kilos for carcass weight, and he'd probably be, you know, as close as possible to 1 or greater for carcass conformation. So okay, those would be just 2 selection criteria. And look, that farmer has to be happy with his own level of risk in terms of calving difficulty, gestation length, but he can tailor it to the cows. More mature cows, you know, you're capable of putting maybe a slightly harder calving bull on those.
And in I suppose management decisions for the dairy farmer, are you talking about them to move this forward using beef AI, or or is it possible to do this by buying the right stock bulls?
Yeah, exactly. Look, I think we need to start using these beef bulls from the very start of the breeding season. So when you're typically AIing your cows to breed your replacements. So I think it's going to be very much blended in. So you'll have a period of AIing. And I think with herds becoming so fertile, I think the bull power that would be needed if you are, you know, going to be generating, you know, 70% of your calf crop from beef sires, I think, you know, it has to be through AI in the main, because the bull power that you'd need to do, you know, really fertile herd, really compact, you know, it would be massive. But certainly, you know, improving the merit of our stock bulls is going to be really important as well. You know, they're going to play a role, you know, they're going to be let run at a certain stage on the majority of farms. So if we can use the DBI to generate and breed bulls of higher genetic merit, it's going to have a positive on the stock bull market as well. And look, I think, you know, they're going to have a massive impact. So we have to, the same principles apply. If it's a straw or if it's the bull, he needs to be a high merit animal irrespective.
Okay, and I suppose just a follow on from that, you're seeing more and more dairy farmers when they're selling potentially calves for replacements. The value of those replacements is being built around the EBI. Do you see any possibility of incorporating that breed information, that genetic information in the pricing, and thereby returning income to the dairy farmer on the basis of high quality beef animals?
Yeah, I think, I think we have to be conscious of the profitability challenge in terms of dairy beef, any beef production system. So I think that the real value added is going to be from the repeatability of the calf purchase, the selling the calf off farm in a timely fashion and making the savings on labour, calf housing, and different things like that. Look, there obviously will be, if you do use much better sires, they will be of a slightly higher value. That will be reflected in the CBV of the animal.
Yep.
So I think, look, there can be, but I wouldn't be using a beef bull with the objective of just adding more onto your calf price, because
Okay.
I think that's why we see the high attrition rate.
Yep.
Because calves are generally overpriced relative to their potential.
Okay.
So we have to be very conscious of that.
A question there in relation to I know we're just coming up to time, in relation to the profitability of the different trials as opposed to the carcass weight. Do you have an indication of that at this stage?
Yeah, not on that. We don't have that study, so we'll have a carbon and an economic figure. I think they're going to go hand in hand, and we have loads of different combinations of the feed managements by the genotypes, and there will be an optimum for each of them identified.
I suppose just one final point. If people are looking for more information on this, you're having an open day up there coming up? Absolutely.
On the 5th of July, we're having the National Beef Open Day here at Teagasc Grange. The animals from this study will be on display. The data will be, most up-to-date data will be presented, as well as data from a range of other studies, a lot of other key technologies around age of slaughter, etc. If you need to know anything about beef, grassland, etc., it's going to be on display on the day.
So put that in the diary. Okay, Andy.
Nicky, thank you very much for that presentation. And with that second last sentence, you just talked yourself into another webinar mentioning economics and carbon budgets. So unfortunately, I'd say we'd be going after you again.
No,
thanks very much for the presentation. Just a few quick things to finish with. I didn't mention them at the start. I'd just like to give a shout out and an acknowledgement really to Dairy Sustainability Ireland, Food Drink Ireland SkillNet, and the National Rural Network, who are our partners in putting this series together. Next week, we're joined by Ted Massey and Leanne Roach, from the department, and they're going to talk about the 5th nitrates action program and beyond. So we're moving along with numbers of nitrates plans as well. Finally, I'd also like to thank our own colleagues, and indeed Yvonne Maher, who's behind the scenes pressing all the buttons. I said there were some buttons being pressed when the power went in Wexford this morning, but anyway, we got there in the end. So I think I've thanked and told you all about next week. So have a nice weekend, and hope to see you all again next Friday morning. So Nicky, thank you, and thanks Pat for the questions. So we'll see you all soon again.
You've been listening to the podcast version of the Teagasc Signpost Series, the weekly webinar that promotes and examines sustainability in Irish farming. Don't forget to join us live every Friday morning for our latest webinar. For more, visit teagasc.ie. And you can also rate, review, and subscribe to the Signpost Series on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts from. I'm Mark Gibson, and thanks for listening.